meetings like this are happening in the UK tonight, like this. It's totally unique. I'm very, very pleased to be here and amongst such august people as well. And to follow Mr. Devlin, Gloria, wow. I mean, I'm not a professional presenter or speaker, but I am a retired teacher. 13 years ago I retired. I taught mainly high school art in 4 Lancashire high schools. I also taught my subsidiary subject of history to years 7 through 9, mostly the chronological story of Ireland's history, from the Romans up to the Tudors and Stuarts, then social and economic history to GCE levels it was then, I'm talking a long time ago. That was during the first 20 years of my 37 years as a teacher, before taking early retirement in 2007. I must say here and now that I became rather disenchanted when the national curriculum was introduced almost overnight, talking about the late 80s, if you remember that. I was mainly an art teacher, and I had taught previously in other schools, at 4 altogether, but I was never involved with any national curriculum planning. But as far as I was aware at the time, I don't think there was a great deal of input from the teachers at the chalk face. Suddenly I was expected to be teaching parts of a syllabus that suddenly had morphed into something rather Eurocentric. Where was our wonderful nation's history, our story? Where had it gone? It appeared to me to be all comparative studies, encouraging students to empathise with stories from the past, to give their own point of view. I felt that then, and still do, even more strongly when I ask youngsters today what they know about English political history that I learned in the 50s and 60s, and the awful realisation hits, they know practically nothing. As for that skeleton of events that I owe my knowledge on, nothing. I bet most of you, or those who were educated in high schools and primary schools, at the time I was, like late 50s, right through the 60s, remember we usually given a framework that went chronologically. And you could hang various events on that. Well, that seemed to disappear. But as I said, I was never a true history teacher. When I joined the profession, I went to it for a job as an art teacher, which is my main subject, and it was art stroke geography in the Times Ed supplement, which were my 2 subjects at college in Leeds. But then said, we're going to offer you the art job, Robert. Thanks very much. But you know this other one, where it says geography? Yeah, it's not, it's history. Oh, no, sorry. You booed then. Oh yeah, it was misprint. But don't worry about it. Just read some history books and keep a couple of weeks ahead of the kids. You'll be fine. Well, of course, I'd done history at A-level. There were too many A-level subjects for me to take. So I dropped the history and carried on with technical drawing, metalwork, art, and geography, I failed that. Anyway, I finished up as I say, as an art and geography teacher. So, I may be wrong, I haven't had any contact with history teaching over the past 20 years, but I recall asking a few students, well after my retirement, about this, and it didn't take long to realise that the framework that I had been taught and did teach myself later had been quietly demolished, with not so much of a murmur from the profession as far as I was aware. Certainly not in the sequential manner I believe it ought to be, to give that chronological skeleton on which to build facts, not fictions. I never quite understood why the French Revolution was suddenly given such a starring role. And as for the Second World War, do me a favour, it seemed to be all-encompassing in those respects. It became Eurocentric. Anyway, that is indeed a massive subject for another time. Back to my theory. It's incredible to be talking about this just a few miles from where this battle happened. I believe the Battle of Hastings stands out as being of interest to many people, even those not particularly historically minded, for obvious reasons. It was our first entry to a wider Europe, for good or bad, and it is somewhat relevant as I write. I'm going to mention the B word. What with Brexit, now our country's future lack of it, or whatever you think about it, for good or ill, my thoughts on that, totally irrelevant for now, because as you know, it's something about the battle. So we've all been taught the bare bones of what happened. If you're anything like me, it happened on October the 14th, 1066. It was a home game for the Anglo-Saxons. It was an away game for Duke William and his famous cavalry-based army, who'd waited patiently all that summer to cross the Channel to invade, and it landed at Pevensey Bay. Built a small modern castle, as far as I'm aware, Bexhill. And I did teach this to the first years in my first teaching post, and I loved it because I wasn't really a properly trained history teacher, it was by default. So I used to love drawing pictures of them, all the Normans on the horses and arrows. You know, not that myth, it probably is a myth. And the kids sort of picked up on my enthusiasm for the subject, and I loved it. I really did enjoy teaching of it. I've always understood the disadvantages and the advantages of the Anglo-Saxon housecarl army, that's what we call the housecarl, under Harold, and its forced march back down the road that we came today. John Hayman and myself came all the way down that Great North Road, and I thought, it looks pretty bad today, but what must it look like then? You know, I mean, can you imagine going through forests and picking people up on the way to boost the army because of the events of that year, which were phenomenal. The most, probably in the top 4 most important battles in human history, I would rather say, because of the potential for what was going to happen after that. I'll ask you something at the end of this. So, they marched back down the Great North Road, having already taken watch on the cliffs of the south. Didn't see the expected Norman invasion because of the winds. Apparently, we thought the winds were blowing in the wrong direction. First thought, I thought, is there no such thing as tacking in those days? I mean, didn't the Vikings do pretty well, going the places that they did? And yet, they were, I've never really understood that. Perhaps you can tell me why. All that summer, the wind was blowing in the faces of the Normans, so they couldn't set sail. Really? Anyway, that's what we're told. That's what you were told. That's what I was told. And that's what I taught to mine, because that's what I was told to do. So, the question started. So, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which is in New York, was a battle against Hardrada and Earl Tostig, Harold's half-brother, I think. But anyway, the battle was won by the Anglo-Saxons under Harold, and they must have lost a lot of men there. A lot of warriors must have been killed. So they made it way back in a rush, not as fast as we came down, but they must have rushed it pretty quick because they'd heard that the Normans had landed on the south coast. They had to defend the country. So, the disposition as a strong shield wall, that's how they would have appeared to be William and his men, on the ridge of Senlac Hill, a place that might well have been displaced all this time. We don't really know, but I know there's some sort of discussion and misunderstanding amongst some people about where the battle actually took place. But what do we know? During my life, I've often woken up with dreams that turned out to be profound insights into all sorts of things, usually to do with my paintings or something to do with recording, because I'm a recording musician. And sometimes they resolve an issue. Usually you've had it yourself. You sleep on it and then you come up with an answer. But sometimes they appear as visions or dreams. And out of the blue, not too long ago, I woke in the middle of the night with a scene on the battle site at Senlac playing over in my mind, and it was so vivid I could smell and hear it, the battle, from above. I could smell the horses and the blood, I could smell the blood, and I could hear the sound of the screeching horses. But the scene in front of that shield wall must have been horrific. It would have been like a butcher's shop. thrust from the shield wall, which is protecting the massive troops behind. And in front must have been a horrendous scene. How could that possibly not have hindered William? And apparently the battle went on all day. It was a really brutal thing. All battles in those days were brutal, but this must have been particularly so. So it was like no dream I'd ever had before. Why? I hadn't been watching any historical films about it. It just came to me one night. And the smell was, I smelt it. It was that strong. I've never had a dream like that before or since. I think I saw why the battle was lost that day, and that's my theory. And there's a Mr. Bates, David Bates, is he coming tomorrow? He's talking about the Bayer Tapestry, and I thought he might have been here tonight because he would probably say, Robert, you got it wrong, but I said, just give me my theory out, okay? Sometimes the unconscious mind can be accessed during sleep, and given what's Freud, if he was not talking about dreams, and the power of dreams, the importance of dreams, what was he talking about? And they can give insights. I mean, Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney.
Which one?
The one that I believe is still living. The one who wrote Yesterday. He said it came to him in a dream and he called it scrambled eggs. Remember that? And he changed it to Yesterday and he asked everybody, has anybody written a song called Yesterday? No. Yesterdays. But nobody's ever penned a song or got it, into any position anywhere. Pardon?
I've got a theory about that.
I've got one as well, but I would have brought it tonight because it was too long and I didn't want to fit it tonight. It's called the PIA theory. Paul is alive. Okay. So I know that dreams are not accepted as prima facie evidence. But this is my theory, and I can only here tonight put my thoughts to you, and probably for the one and only time. I did have a very vivid dream in March of this year, just prior to lockdown number 1. Which one are we in now? To do with COVID, and if you wish to hear that, what I saw in it, you can ask me later, or during the weekend. But, because I saw what I believe, and I've now been proved to be correct, why people were dying in large numbers in hospitals. I could see a body and see what they were doing to it and what was going on in the body. Very vivid, very vivid. Anyway, when I'm done with the Battle of Hastings, you maybe will ask me. My insight is this. It is something I've never read or heard about before with regard to the Battle of Hastings. Maybe I haven't read enough about it. Does anyone remember that great book that we were all given by teachers, or they read from it, called 1066 and all that? Yeah. Remember that? It was a penguin book, wasn't it? I mean, I've not read that since I was about 14, but I don't think this is in it, this theory of mine. So maybe somebody can put me straight. Halfway through the battle, when both sides would have been tiring, because if you know what it's like, I mean, women don't usually fight battles like men do, but it doesn't take long before you're drained of all energy, wielding a heavy sword or an axe. And don't forget, you've legged it all the way down from Stamford Bridge, which is no mean distance. So, Duke William would have been extremely frustrated with his inability to break the almost unbreakable Saxon shield wall. That's what they were famous for. The Normans were mainly famous for the cavalry charges and the heavy horses. I don't know whether there were heavy horses, but it would have taken a lot to bring one down. But when you've got a few thousand Anglo-Saxons swearing at you, that's the first thing they would have done, because that's the way to do it. And they would have been probably tanked up with mead, maybe, and taking other substances. I'm sure Gloria would be knowledgeable of any other substances that the Saxons might have taken in a battle. I don't know. Nobody really knows what they were doing with herbs and things in those days. But anyway, they were up for the battle because the kingdom depended upon it. Right, so it would have been very frustrating, William. And this is what we're told. He was fighting uphill and losing men with every charge, whilst the Saxons, although exhausted, were fighting for the country's freedom at the end of the day on the soil of England, and were disciplined enough to be surviving very well behind their shields. We've all been taught that this discipline did not last, and that it led to the routing by the Norman cavalry of less disciplined Saxons who ran down the hill into open ground after William's men had faked a retreat. That's known to everybody. I believe there is another aspect to this. Behind all armies, well into the late Middle Ages, were baggage trains. These would have consisted of ordinary citizens who, whilst they were maybe not able to fight on the front line itself, including women, of course, they were happy to serve their army with special skills and logistics. They served a very useful function. They would have been able to attend to the wounded and who'd fallen back out of sight behind the shield wall, and they would have been able to administer dressings of some kind to flesh wounds, to get men back into the action as soon as possible to those who could. Deal with them, and in the case of the fatally wounded ones, there would be priests administering the rites. Now, this may have been for the William's men as well, but I don't know about that. I really don't know about that. But clergy would be there to administer last rites, and they would have had water on carts in barrels, and there would be pitchers, probably made of leather, and a cache of replacement weaponry and armoury, and they would have been constantly kept at the best strength that they could because of this baggage train. Now, least of all, there would have been butchers and bakers with ample stocks of meat and bread to pass to soldiers during the melee. How important was this to keep the men's spirits up? Think about it, it would have been very important. Is it not likely that at some point, and this is what I saw very vividly, William made his archers move quite close to the shield wall without being hit from spears, whatever weapons they had. I don't think the Anglo-Saxon army was particularly well known for being archers. They were mainly infantry. They didn't. The great period of archers came later, didn't it? When we massacred French troops, Agincourt, Cressy, and that was a mass slaughter. An incredible power of the longbow. If anybody's been to Mary Rose, there's an actual English longbow there, and a builder, a big guy next to me, so I can pull that back. And I went, it was a real one, and I got it to about there. He went, and it was, they were firing like that in that day. They had such strong shot, they found that in bones, and they incredibly, and a lot of them were Welsh. They were famous for archery. And it was compulsory to train with bows. And then football took over. Really? Did? Yeah. Couldn't get them because they were all kicking a ball about on Sundays. But you could be in trouble for not training with a bow. And we're famous for it throughout Europe. So, William decided to get these archers, the Breton archers, the famous Breton archers, they had their well-known archers as well, to fire not at the shield wall, because that wasn't having much of an impression, but to fire over to hit the baggage train at the back. And this is very vivid. And I could see women, children, clergymen, bakers, everybody associated with the baggage train that was supporting the army, being killed and dying in front of the troops, and they were getting very angry. They were getting very vexed indeed. And the shafts were falling amongst but the main troops were still hiding behind the shield wall, like the testudo, which is the Roman way of protecting themselves with the overlapping shields. So this would have enraged everybody in the main Saxon army, and surely it would have had the instant result of causing panic behind the lines. And many of the helpers would have been injured or worse, killed. Many of these would be relatives of the men on the front line. Barrels, pitchers of water were possibly in function and leaking. Provisions of food and water were severely disrupted. Possibly, I'm only saying this is what I saw, and this is theory. Possibly, at this point, some of the more disciplined soldiers around Harold would have remonstrated with the king, pleading with him to allow some of them to leave the shield wall, to remove the archers in question who moved nearer to the front line, and some of them would shelter. I saw it in this vision, dream, whatever. Sounds a bit grand, but that's what I saw. They were sheltering their dead horses because they were piled up, and they weren't able to be hit by or attacked by the men on the front line, because they had these dead bodies and dead horses, and they could literally do that over the top. And that was a kind of turning point. So, yes, it will put them in danger, but they were able to fire over, and the soldiers couldn't nullify these archers and return to the ranks before the feared Norman cavalry would regroup and charge them uphill again. Was this the point where William cleverly introduced his feint and then bring onto the battlefield fresh horsemen from the flanks? These things are often won in minutes. Just one decision. The great thing about generals throughout the centuries, of course, is they can see the lie of the land and just at the right time bring in a particular force to act and turn a lever on the opposing army. And I think this is what happened. Was this the point where William cleverly brought fresh horsemen from the flanks that were in the trees or hidden away from the Saxons? Being the disciplined king we think he was, Harold would have told his men to stand firm, obviously. Or did he also believe the day had turned in his favour? We don't have accurate accounts, do we? Obviously, at this point, some of the lesser troops towards the edges, or we're told that the main troops were around Harold in the centre. Some of these adherents from the trip down, unless they weren't fighting men, a lot of them would have been farmers with sharpened bill hooks or whatever they had from the farms. Many of them wanted to possess sharp instruments. Did they break rank first? This would have led to the weakening of the Anglo-Saxon army by giving up their one great advantage, which balanced up the odds in their favour, namely the excellent strategic positioning on the hill. The question every historian and strategy expert must ask here is, why did William allow Harold's army to gather on the best hill in the locale, given that the Normans had been in the area for some time? When the battle commenced, why give up the advantage to an already weakened enemy? There's something wrong there. There's something very logistically wrong there. We've been told for centuries that he went uphill. Wouldn't he have occupied the high ground and said, right, Harold, come on, take us on. Come uphill, attack us. He didn't do that. He attacked uphill. Does anybody find that rather strange? I do. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Why has this story been told like this all these years? I believe we should rethink this most important defining moment of one of the most strategic battles in human history. For centuries later, the descendants of the victorious Normans and their pyramidical structure of governance led to a small island nation which forged an empire on which it said the sun never set. You see, before the Normans attacked successfully, the system of ownership of land and buildings in this country was known as the allodial system. And it was basically the ownership of land and title and deeds and property without any feudal oversight. The nobles couldn't say, that's mine, before William came and then said, that's mine. And I'll prove it because I'll make a survey of everything that I've got from you. Of course, we know when that happened, 20 years later, called the Doomsday Book. Called the Doomsday Book because people said, he's got so much down about us, how many pigs we've got, how many goats we've got, that even at doomsday, all they need to do to find out what we've got is read this out. It was a perfect survey. So what would have happened if the Normans had been defeated on that day? Would the allodial system of governance continue under King Harold and his Saxon descendants following a Saxon victory? Where would Britain have gone after that? England, then Britain. Would it have happened to, would the Scots become a richer nation, side by side with the Anglo-Saxons, and not being sort of divided later on and then united? Everything would have been different. We know now, getting to the end, so I'm not going to keep it very much longer, but we know how the weakest link in any army is its ability to survive and fight on in bad conditions. The provision of water and food is often overlooked, I feel, in accounts of the great many historical battles. I believe I might be onto something here, but I would just like to see a balancing up of all the information available to us, as too often history is made unrealistically simplistic. I've been very conscious while I've been teaching history all those years ago that, I'm sorry kids, but I'm only teaching this because, I used to be quite honest with them, I'm only teaching this because it's part of the syllabus, the curriculum. I'm not really telling you what happened, because how can I? It happened. I'm not saying that Henry VIII did this, or you've got to look at so many different sources. Doesn't matter what truth you're looking at, you've got to take everything and then just make a synthesis in your own mind, and don't even then say this is the truth. You can't. It's not possible with history. Henry Ford, didn't he say history is bunkum? I think it was history. Was it? History is bunkum. History is bunkum. History is bunkum. Life has taught me that folk prefer faked simplicity rather than the drudgery of studying all the possible grey areas and minutiae of occurrences that human action is built on. Thank you very much. Any questions about what might have happened, or what any insights into what I've just said?
One question.
Yes, sir.
The tacking on the boats, why the boat didn't tack? You know, you were talking about that. Correct. Do you think it might have been to do with the design of the boat? Because obviously, sailboats tack because they've got a swinging boom and they've got a big keel and they can tack. They've got a flat front boat, but they can't do that. So they would have had weather dependent. Absolutely. So the wind direction would have been a big.
Well, that's what we saw, I think. Yeah.
So that's probably the reason.
But didn't there wasn't some kind of ability to sack a little bit with that, because they were basically Norsemen, weren't they?
Yeah.
Normans were Vikings, descended from the Vikings,
But attacking
and they've been everywhere.
Yeah. But attacking now is totally different. I mean, we can tack. So it doesn't matter what direction we're in, particularly. You know, you can get it wrong. I don't think we would have been able to do it that easily with those boats. I don't think.
Well, that's what I was thought. I was believed that I'm not saying.
The Vikings rowed.
Did they row all the way across the North Sea?
Yeah, long distance.
And they did go across the North Sea. They did come straight across to Lindisfarne. And they went through the Shetland, and they carried boats across from one island to another apparently as well. They were literally that strong in those days. We're puny little beings compared to the average Viking. Totally puny. But they didn't live that long, did they?
On history, Mark Twain's definition is that history is the Mississippi of lies. And that's what I mentioned earlier about truth is suppressed. And the more I studied this, I found, unfortunately, that's quite true.
Yeah.
The official version is lies on any subject.
Yeah.
It did quote history is written by the winners.
History is written by the victors.
There was another battle with the Norsemen after Stamford Bridge, wasn't there, before they moved south? Fulford. That's it, Fulford, yeah.
Yes, but wasn't that a route when they literally set fire to the Viking boats? They were already defeated, weren't they, when they went to Fulford? The Vikings were The famous story about, does anyone remember the famous story about the Viking bridge, the Viking standing on the little bridge across the river, Ouse, isn't it? The River Ouse, Yorkshireman, River Ouse, and it was that big that the Anglo-Saxons were just getting knocked from, they were coming at him and he was just going, I'm a Viking, you don't pass me. And then the famous story that I taught to the kids, love this, they love this. Some Anglo-Saxon, ingenious Englishman gets into the water behind a floating log, puts camouflaging, webbing, not webbing, twigs, looking like just a log floating down the river, and he's gets under the bridge, and he gets his spear, and the Viking is stuck, and he goes, and he drops off. Use your imaginations, girls, and he drops off. And then the English come pouring across the bridge, this is the story, and routed the Vikings on the other side of the bank. That's a wonderful little thing that I love to tell the kids. I don't think for a minute it's true, actually. Yes, John?
What your lecture brought to my mind is analogous with 900 years later, effectively, when the D-Day landed. Now, he brought a whole army. Now, how on earth, I mean, we sort of think, oh, you bring in horses, and how on earth you bring all that baggage across and not be noticed?
Well, the average Anglo-Saxon at that time was a mere bystander, looking and expecting and probably not even bothering to look anymore, because for months he'd been told that Harold's Anglo-Saxon army was, and there were only about 6,000 or 7,000 or 8,000 at most. Yeah. I mean, it's not even enough to fit into Preston North End's football ground. I mean, in one corner. I mean, they'll soon dispatch, really, because when we think of armies, you know, usually 40,000, 50,000 legionary times, Roman times, many legions fighting mass battles on mass plain. There weren't that many Saxons, and there weren't that many Normans came across, but they won the land, and then they parcelled it out to the victors. Well, they would have been horses. There would have been galleys with horses in it, just horses. Yeah, nothing else, just a boatsman or a coxswain just bringing their boat. I don't think the cavalry, Anglo-Saxon cavalry, was used at Senlac Hill. I don't think so. I might be proved wrong, I don't know.
Sure, both armies would just take horses from farms on their travels if they needed.
I think they need training. But the thing is that I want to make a point on, logistically, isn't it a bit strange for William to allow has anybody thought of this?
Well, that's what I was coming at. The timing must
Why
have
do you
took.
allow them to take the high ground?
It must have took weeks to get that army across.
Yeah.
Why didn't he go and dominate the high ground?
He should have dominated the landscape. He should have made his way in line. He stayed there.
From which direction?
He was coming from Bexhill to Hastings towards. He should have made his move towards London on a broad front, and he didn't. He just stayed there, waiting. Come on, Anglo-Saxons. We'll be at the bottom of the hill. You take the top of the hill and we'll attack you. There must have been outposts and spotters. The Anglo-Saxons are coming down this road, and they're walking pretty slowly because they walked all the way down. And William should have really prepared his position on the Senlac Hill, because that was chosen as being the best place to have the battle. But why wasn't it occupied by William? I mean, I think it's a very weird thing.
The Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederate generals made the same mistake.
Same mistake, yeah.
Exactly. Not taking the little round top.
The men's house is more there. Bexhill, didn't they build, I don't know this area very well, but if anybody's local, didn't they build the Motte and Bailey Castle at Bexhill?
Maybe they wanted to stay near the castle.
They wanted to stay.
They were put under siege conditions.
I think they stayed there because they wanted to be able to escape quickly on the boats, which would have been tied up along Pevensey Bay, which is that shell beach that they came in. Maybe they didn't want
a bit of a challenge there. If he had a lot of horses, he would have needed water for the horses. So that may have, forced him into the position of being on lower ground.
Where there was many
I don't
streams.
disagree with you about being a fast
That's what the point.
Sorry.
Yes. But they would also brought water with them, or been able to collect water in whatever barrels or pitchers that they had.
Yeah, that works well for an army on foot, but not quite so well for an army.
It's a fascinating matter. I don't believe they've ever found any artefacts, have they? Because what would have happened directly after that? The locals, scared to death as they were because they knew that their army was lying in pieces on the battle. Oh no, we've now got to kowtow to a foreign invading king, invading Norman lord, because it then was, as you know, possibly, was crowned on Christmas Day in Westminster Abbey, which hadn't been built that long before by Henry the Confessor, the pious king. And even then, he was worried that the Anglo-Saxons wanted to turn on him, because as he was being crowned, the Norman troops were prodding all the Anglo-Saxons to cheer your new king. And inside they thought that there was a revolution going on, so they weren't 100%, the Normans weren't 100% dominant. It's only later when they came very, very dominant, and then we get the pyramidal structure of power, feudal system, which I think is still going on today. Hello, John.
Yes, that's two questions.
One thing that really puts his name is, and it sort of kind of links to the fact that you said William allowing Harold higher ground. Why on earth did William wait for Harold up there at all? Because he knew 2 weeks in advance that he was on his way. Why didn't he just go to London? I mean, there was no knowing the army. Well, he could have taken London.
He could have. He probably didn't know. He overestimated the strength of the Saxon army. He didn't know where they were. And it's just, that's a good question.
Do you think he set off in that general direction?
He could have, well, he did go all the way around. He got to London from the east, I believe. He came round. And then eventually he made his centre of power at Berkhamsted. Not in London. Berkhamsted in Berkshire, is it? Hertfordshire. Yeah, that's where he finished up. Immediately. And then, of course, there was the harrying of the north. The part of England where we come from, Lancashire, Yorkshire, was very much against the takeover. They literally tried to rebel against the incoming Normans, and there were massacre. There was a root and branch destruction of the north of England, the harrying of the north. And then, where's the lady from Norfolk? I'm going to mention Hereward. Hereward the way, of course, I used to say Hereward the not very way.
Lincolnshire.
Pardon?
Lincolnshire.
Okay, somebody from Norfolk, I thought.
So Harold was from Lincolnshire.
But he hid in the fence.
He was hid in the fence, the Cambridgeshire fence.
Yeah, the Cambridgeshire fence. So
Yeah,
a bit further
Ely.
up, around about Ely, okay.
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, have you talked to any reenactors about this? Because they reenact the battle. I don't think they did this year, but most years they're out there annually reenacting it.
Didn't
And
some-
they would explore it, because, they're addicted to the whole thing. They would have thought about that. They also use replica boats as well.
Because it was
They all
incredibly,
those aspects.
incredibly difficult
So
to
if you
raise.
told them about your dream, reenact it, you'd probably have to get in there, sort of join a group, find out who best to talk to before you go. So I've had this dream, I'd like to just put it past
But I
you.
like the idea of this.
But they're addicted to whatever period they reenact.
Yeah.
And there are the facing people. In fact, I talked to one a few years ago who hoped he lived long enough to recreate the battle in 2066. He'd happy to die